Scripture reading tonight comes from 1 John chapter 5, verse 20. Here we see John writing some concluding marks in a section that talks about great Christian certainties. We know also that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true, even in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life.
Good evening, church. I don't have my usual Bills mug today, because that needs to get washed. But nonetheless, go Bills. What was that, babe? Go Bills, that's right. And what do we say? Go away, Cowboys. That's what we say. I almost didn't want to leave the house to come over here because we had some people over and we're all gathered around a table sharing stories and having a good time. And I was reminded of the Good Samaritan story, how it was okay to stop along the road and help somebody out instead of fulfill your responsibilities, right? But I'm here. Don't worry. I'm not going to ditch this. There's something about stories that pulls us away and that pulls us into something engaging and something worthwhile and something meaningful. It's stories that we tell, but also stories that we have. This book right here is full of stories that we learn from. And so today I want to tell a story. Maybe a story that I haven't shared too much, but a story nonetheless. So the title of the lesson is Atheist to Christian. And so I want to, at the beginning of this, bear with me, I want to talk about myself a little bit and my story because I see some value in it. But ultimately, if you hang with me long enough, I want to tell this story and how it correlates. And I think all of you who have your own stories of life, of faith, you'll find the same in how it correlates in here. So if you don't know, my name is Richard Webster Allen II, named after my dad, Richard Webster Allen I. I was born in Syracuse, New York, December 28th, 1988. I have mom, a dad. I have an older brother. I had two younger sisters. I found out yesterday that one of them has passed. So that's the first time using it past tense. So, grew up in Syracuse till the age of 10, then moved down to Smyrna, Georgia. It's right outside of Atlanta, Georgia. All four of us kids and two parents, we all grew up in a 3-bedroom apartment, 2 bathrooms. Sometimes it was a lower apartment, sometimes it was a higher one, like a townhome situation. It wasn't until I was 14 until we had our first yard, our first house. And when we moved down to Georgia, it was just us. All my family lives in upstate New York. Talked about my Uncle Larry before. He owns some acreage that we helped out at, picking rocks out of the driveway, spread fertilizer in his field, bale some hay, make sure the chickens stay in the barn, all sorts of fun stuff that 10-year-old kids love to do on vacation and holiday out in the countryside, right? Y'all would love to do that, I imagine. Most of my family still lives up in New York. A lot of my family lives in Georgia still. I have some family here in Texas. My mom lives in Georgetown, just north of Austin. She works for IBM. A very, very nice job. And then Kaylee's side of the family, they live out in Fort Worth or Weatherford. Thank you, baby. So they have some acreage where he now gets to work on a farm and tend to horses and goats and chickens and all that. There's some horses out there, and there's a miniature horse. What's the miniature horse's name? Biggie, yep. Don't let the name fool you. It's a very small horse that he gets to ride, though. It's only yours. So growing up, we learn a lot of lessons. Well, growing up in our house, my dad, he grew up trying to attend Roman Catholic gatherings where he would ask questions and never receive an answer for any of his questions. And so at the age of 12, he got tired of people not answering his questions and his family situation growing so hard and difficult that he eventually moved out and moved into a bar at the age of 12. My mom, she grew up in going to Roman Catholic Church, Mass, and all that sort of thing. They met and had my older brother when my mom was 17. My dad just turned 16. Had 4 kids by the time my dad was 22 and my mom was 24. Very interesting life. My dad, because he couldn't get answers to his questions, he was, in his words, a very devout atheist. My mom would still hold fast to her Roman Catholic background, but still never do anything with it. And so growing up, we would just believe whatever Dad said. He is more convicted in his beliefs, and he would evangelize about it a lot more. Well, fast forward a lot of time, and so our family had a lot of problems, as every family does. And so you try to write things off. It's like, oh, well, it's just survival of the fittest. It's just human nature. Just all these things, and so you tend to grow a little calloused. And so people, in my eyes, people who believed this book and the writings inside of this book believed in fairy tales. Equivalent to a Pixar or Disney movie, a feel-good story. They attended gatherings, much like this one, to hear somebody tell them how they just were awful at handling the world's problems, and they needed help. So I grew up making fun of Christians with my dad. I made fun of these, what I perceived to be book clubs, telling over-exaggerated stories of a guy who lived a long time ago who was, behaved better than the rest. And I'd try to let all my friends know about it, how they were silly for believing such a story, and adapting their lifestyle to believing such a story. There's a movie that came out while I was in high school. It was Passion of the Christ. Some of you, it came out when you were much older than high school age. And so my friend, he was from Poland. He was here as an exchange student at our high school in Georgia. And so I nicknamed him Poland because I forgot his name. I think it was only right to do. And he didn't seem to mind. We're close friends. Every now and then he'd ask if he could pray for me. I told him no. Never asked me that again. He asked me if I wanted to go to see the Passion of the Christ movie when it first came out. I told him no. Never invite me to that again. Well, around the same time, Kaylee and I, we developed a friendship. Her background's a little bit different. She also had some life problems in her family, but she was committed to attending church gatherings and Bible studies, and she was developing her own faith. So we were friends. She was dating somebody at the time who's not me. And so we're just friends. She invited me to church gatherings and Bible studies, and I told her no. Thought they were silly. So we talked on something called AOL Instant Messenger. Anybody remember AOL Instant Messenger? Who had a dial-up modem? Y'all have a dial-up modem? Well, 4 kids in the house. You can never keep the internet connected because somebody always wanted to call one of their friends. So in between the time that our internet would cut out, I would try to flirt with her on AOL Instant Messenger. Then we'd also spend time with friends doing athletic things or me trying to make her laugh. I thought she had a nice laugh. But also I was kind of observing. This is a Christian. I get to observe what a Christian is. I never thought she was silly or misguided. And then eventually, August of my second senior year of high school came up, and I dropped down into her grade. She's older than me, by the way, by a month and 19 days. So from November 9th until December 28th, I make sure that she knows it. She robbed the cradle. So I'd flirt with her, and she'd always say, hey, do you want to come to Bible class with me? Do you want to come to Bible study with me? And in my eyes, as an atheist, I thought, well, Sunday is really intimidating, so absolutely not. And then she told me about Wednesdays. Eventually, one night, we're talking online. She asked me to go, and I said no. And then the next day, I asked her if I could go. Now, in my mind, with all the stuff going on in my family, I thought, well, I need to figure out if I'm right about the world. And this is my chance to find out what Christians actually do. So the next day, I asked if I could go with her to a Wednesday night Bible class. And she said, well, I guess so. You turned me down yesterday, but I guess you could come with me. So after school, I went with her home, and then we had Bible class the next day. From then on out, for 9 months, went with her to Bible classes. Got to know a lot of people. Now, my dad didn't like this too much, being the devout atheist that he was. The Paul of atheism, I guess. So instead of telling him that I was going to Bible class, I lied. I was an atheist, what does it matter, right? I wasn't going to heaven anyway. So I lied. I said, oh, we're doing homework. Then eventually I started going to Sunday nights, because that's less intimidating. And then I got the courage for the big show. Sunday morning. Everybody dresses up on Sunday morning. Asked her if I could go on Sunday mornings, and so my dad wondered, I'm sure, where I was going all the time. But my dad liked wife, or girlfriend at the time. I still didn't know her name. He liked her, so it was like, oh, well, he's spending time with somebody who he likes, and it was really nice. So I'd always lie, like, oh, we're getting breakfast together. Oh, we're going over homework together. Oh, we're spending time with friends together. Again, I didn't mind if I lied. Chicho, don't lie. Eventually, somebody came up to me after going there for a little bit. Somebody came up to me by the name of Lance Levins. Lance, he was a nurse in a hospital. Eventually, he became a preacher down in Houston, I think at Champions Church of Christ, and then he moved with his family all the way up north, I think, to Montana. Well, Lance and his wife, they came up to me after a month or so of attending Bible classes, and he said, well, we were wondering if you wanted to have like a personal Bible study with us. You know, you and Kaylee and me and my wife, and I told him, no, thought it was silly. I don't want part of your book club. I'll read fairy tales by myself. A couple months later, I'll abbreviate that situation. A couple months later, I turned to Kaylee. I said, okay, I'll try to learn about this stuff as much as I could. Even if I wind up disagreeing with it, I'll still try to learn about it. So I said, do you think Lance would be interested in having a Bible study? And she said, I think so. I think he'd still be up for that. So through the course of our conversation and our Bible studies together, we met whenever we were available. Sometimes it was Thursday night. Sometimes it was after Bible class on Wednesday. Sometimes it was just at their house, just hanging out together. Well, the thing about Kaylee growing up in all this is she got to know a lot of Christian people. She got to go to their houses. Right? She was a young girl. Her parents weren't attending stuff, and so she'd go to services, and she was kind of the adopted kid of all these families. Well, good thing for me, I got to know a lot of Christian families in their own houses on Monday nights for dinner and Sunday after service, or in between service, where you're supposed to be napping, or you turn off the best parts of your Christian self just for a moment until Sunday night. This is my perspective at the time. And I got to know Christian people, got to travel around with them, and I figured they weren't so bad, but still not for me. How would they put up with my stubbornness? How would they put up with my questions? Well, not the youth minister, but the teacher of the youth in Bible classes, he turned out to work for a nuclear engineering company. So I thought, if I get to ask any of my scientific questions, right? I was 16, 17 at the time. What did I know? I think I knew it all. Then he would be the person that I ask. Oh, this other person, Lance, he worked at a hospital. I could ask him all my scientific questions. And they were never put off by my stubbornness. Even if they didn't answer something or couldn't answer something, that didn't put them off. They didn't lose confidence. They said, I'll go look it up. Let's look it up together. So that stuck with me. Meanwhile, Kaylee, she served as a bridge. I often tell people, I can't remember her teaching me something, book, chapter, verse. I just remember her living it. Her dealing with her own similar home life. And her just still full of joy. And her serving as a bridge. Well, fast forward 9 months. July 19th, 2007. It's a Thursday night, 8:30 is when we finished our Bible study with Lance and his wife Susan. That's when I decided to be baptized. And then all the prayers that Kaylee and I had before meals, whenever we'd go out to eat together, now is my responsibility to say them. We went to Dairy Queen, I believe, that night to celebrate, and she said, "Your turn." Whoo! I don't know if I was ready for that. Then I read somewhere in this book, if your wife has a question, go to the husband first. I said, whoa, she grew up in this. I'm a straggler, an adopted kid. What am I going to do? Well, get to work. Start reading. Start listening to lessons. So this isn't my first Bible. This is one of the first. I lost my first one at this Methodist kid's house. This is a Bible I had since college. There's something interesting about the cover. It's no longer attached. Something interesting about the New and the Old Testament, no longer attached. Something interesting about the cover, it's barely holding on. Somewhere in the Psalms, I think I have a missing page somewhere. I just saw it. Missing page. It's tattooed up, there's notes. Made it colorful. I saw from her Bible, it was all colorful. It was all noted. The margins, as skinny as they were, they had notes, little messages in them of where she could find something. I saw her turning to these during my atheistic days, my BC days, before Christ's days. I saw her turning in her Bible to her notes whenever the preacher or youth guy would say something. So I was like, oh, well, I guess it's okay that you write in these. So it wasn't just the pages, it's, front cover, that weird area between the Old and New Testament where you kind of have half a page, right before Jesus came. You fill that in. In your free time, you listen to all these lessons. Well, when I became a Christian, there's one person I had in mind to talk to. My dad. Out of everybody, he was the only person I prayed for. And so I set out not only to answer my future wife's questions, but his. Now, my dad is a lot more stubborn than I am. Even to today, he's still an atheist. Well, that's what he says. But I don't think that there's one true atheist in the entire world. Judge people off of their actions, you'll see that human beings tend to operate off of the principles of love and mercy and justice and truth and all these things. And so maybe their actions and their words don't really correlate, don't really line up. So my dad says one thing, but his actions say something different. And I set out to answer every single one of his questions. I set out to learn how to communicate in a variety of ways. Every time I'd come home on a college break, first couple years I stayed with my dad, second couple years I stayed with my mom. Winter, spring break, summer, fall break, on and on, I would just try to engage with him with something. Here's the thing about that, though. If people aren't ready, it doesn't matter how much you learn. It doesn't matter even that you know how to say it in a variety of ways. And so I noticed this, a lot of hateful conversations. A lot of times he hung up the phone with me. A lot of times being cussed out on the phone or in person. A lot of doors slammed. A lot of texts unanswered every single day. Tried to talk to him. For 2 years straight, this was the result. So I said, well, he's being a really mean person. So let me turn my attention to the other 4 members of my family. Maybe they deserve some attention. My mom and my older brother were baptized once I started staying with them, but also taking a page out of my wife's approach, just introducing them to the church. The people who I got to know. I don't think I ever answered a single question for them. I just put them around people who could, but also people who developed relationships. There's a statement that I remember, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And people can generally tell if you're being manipulative about it. And so for them, introducing them to the church, just as I was. So ever since then, still trying to learn and grow. And I realized the more you learn, the less, or the more you figure out, the less you know. There's so much information out there. There's so many people in here who've forgotten more about this book than I've yet to learn. Just as how knowledgeable and how scholarly you are. Most of you have had life experiences that are 3 times what mine have been. Yet you're still here, and you have your own stories. So what was it? Was it a Bible verse? Was it a near-death experience? Was it something traumatizing? No. I just found real Christians. I sat around a table with them, their dining room table, shared a meal with them. I got to see their pain, their suffering. I got to hear their stories. And I thought, some of these sound similar to mine. And yet you have hope. Yet you have joy. The best I could do on my own efforts is happiness. Happiness and joy are not the same thing. Happiness is temporary. It feels good, the dopamine rush. Joy, though, as Scripture says, is something different. Joy lasts through suffering. Happiness does not. I often compare it to my relationship with coffee. You always need more coffee. But maybe if I had better sleep habits, I wouldn't need coffee so much. Maybe if I didn't have kids, I wouldn't need coffee so much. Maybe if I didn't spend a lot of time around teenagers, maybe I wouldn't need coffee so much. On and on and on. Happiness is coffee. Hope that's okay to say. Joy is not. Joy withstands suffering. And I saw all these people with joy. Yes, there were some pretenders. Yes, there were people trying to use this for their own personal gain and validation. You have people who look in this book and try to prove their points with it. Y'all have encountered people like this, right? When opinion becomes doctrine, instead of dealing with insecurities, I'll just gloss over it, saying it's fine. You meet people with stories. You talk to people about their life and their faith and who God is to them. You start finding a common thread. There was a Christ. There is a Christ. And this is who he is. That's what they told me. This is my role in this story. And that's what they told me. Now, I didn't care that it was Christianity when I was searching. I just wanted to figure out what was true. That's it. I remember telling her this. I said, I just want to figure out what the true thing is so I could hurry up and live my life. If it is atheism, if there is no God, we're here by chaos. We're not held accountable for our actions unless we put people in charge of us. But no ultimate accountability. There is no such thing as sacrificial love. There is no such thing as justice or mercy. If these things were true, I didn't care. I just wanted to hurry up and learn them so I could go about living my life. And so it was never atheism or Christianity. There's a lot of other options. Brandon said how many Bible translations, how many divisions in Christendom there are in the world. Or do you think all the other world beliefs? Or the lack of world beliefs? See, atheism is very much a belief based off of faith. There's a book that somebody gave me a long time ago. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Love that book. Atheism is a claim to faith, even if it's a lack of faith. It's still a result of what they deem as evidence. Little side note, faith is not blind. Faith is looking at who God was to people in the past, assessing your current situation, remembering those experiences of God in the past, and seeing, okay, from here on out, what will God do? Faith is very calculated still. For me, it's very logical. It's like, well, if that was God before, and those were the types of people he came through for, Hebrews 11. And those were the situations where God showed up. Well, I'm dealing with something very similar, so I should have faith that God will still show up. It says that he's never changing. Same God from the past, present, future. So I should be able to rely on that, right? So you apply these things, and then they turn out to be true. And enough foundational things turn out to be true. So you look into all the world religions, you look into Islam, you look into Buddhism, you look into Taoism, you look into spiritualism or mysticism, you look into all of them. And you start with what you know is true. Take a scientific approach here. You start with what you know is true. You don't have to start from ground zero because you've already proved to yourself some evidences. Even my dad, the most atheist person I know, I haven't talked to him in 10 years. At least 10 years. Does he approve of what I'm doing right now? Not in the slightest. But do I believe that he would gladly jump in front of a car to save my life? Absolutely. He's still my dad. There's still sacrificial love there. Would he care about any acknowledgement afterwards? No, because he doesn't believe that you're able to witness the acknowledgement. Would he care about any statues built in his name or any stories that I tell my kids? No. Would he still do it? Yes. So you start with love. Everybody experiences sacrificial love. Everybody holds to sacrificial love. Well, this book, in a concise fashion, says that's one of the foundations of this belief. It even says that the love that the followers of God have towards each other In Deuteronomy it says this. It says that love will prove what kind of God this is. How he answers prayers, how you interact with each other in a sacrificial, loving basis. Christ reiterates this later on when he talks about the two greatest commandments. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. You don't need to find loopholes if you're living your life like that. The 10 Commandments don't need to exist if they just believed, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. The 613 commandments that the Jews came up with don't need to exist if you're loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And so I knew that love must be a foundational thing if people who are adamantly against a higher power are willing to abide by it. So you look at all these things, and so you could easily cancel stuff out and say that it's not true. See, the thing about truth, it wants to be discovered. Truth withstands testing. 2 + 2 equals? Chris? 2 + 2 equals? Thank you, baby. Sentence structure has a noun, verb, object. Whatever language you're speaking, it might be in a different order, but pretty much that's the same. What other truths exist? Gravity. If I drop this pen, what will happen to it? It'll fall. If I'm on the moon, will it still fall? Just at a slower rate. I dropped a pen, thank you. See, the thing about truth, it doesn't matter if you fight against it, it maintains. It withstands. Now, if we didn't accept truth, we'd still be jumping off of buildings trying to fly. So for me, I wanted to hurry up and get to truth. Then I could play. So if this book is true, again, at that time it didn't really matter, but if this book is true, then I should hurry up and try to learn it. If this God is true, then I should hurry up and try to learn it so I could get to the fun stuff. Because we understand gravity and how it works, we can now invent stuff such as airplanes, fast-moving cars, hot air balloons, paragliders, you name it, stuff affected by gravity. We could explore space because we understand gravity not just on this world, but maybe outside of it, and maybe even on another planet. Now you could play. If you understand the power of storytelling and what it means for people, that's a truth. I think we're all supposed to learn how to tell our stories. Because in our stories is evidence, concrete evidence, of God. I tell the teens in class all the time, even before this was constructed, every single story that exists in the world is based off of this. Every single story. You name it, video game, song, Epic of Gilgamesh, you name it. Every single story, every single mythology is based off of the story of Christ. There's something in storytelling called the monomyth. Raise your hand if you know of the monomyth. Man with 1,000 faces. So in this theory, in this proven fact, every single successful story that there is, that has ever been told, follows the same formula. You're in this normal world, you're called to adventure. Boop. Let's go this way. Called to adventure. It's your responsibility to accept this adventure. When you do, you inherit a guide to usher you into this new world. Boop. You endure some training, some testing. You learn how this new world works. Boop. Then you have your big showdown. Boop. You battle until you get it right. When you get it right, you move on. Now it's the return home. You get your prize. Boop. You enter the threshold back to where you first came from to share this new inherited wisdom. Boop. And then it's reintroducing people to this new idea, this message of salvation, this message of redemption. Boop. The cycle keeps continuing. Every single story follows this pattern. Well, this is a story of Christ. Every great story, every story that there is based off of this book, whether they realize it or not. And so, if you want to get to the fun stuff, there's a sense of acknowledgement, attribution, attributing the things that you experience to the right places. Yes, because you need to, but also not because you need to. I believe it's Acts 17. It talks about God doesn't need anything from us. He doesn't need the worship. He doesn't need people following him. He doesn't need these temples made by hands. We get to have a relationship with him. For example, my kids. If I do something good for them, how do you think it'd make me feel if he attributes it to one of y'all? It's like, oh, Wendell made this steak. It's like, oh, I did. I grilled it to perfection. It's like, oh, well, this person, they taught me this. Well, I remember doing that. Or, it's like, oh, well, this person gave birth to me. You better not take that from her. So it feels good, but it's also honest. This God is based off of, yes, love, but also truth. And the combination of those make this God very, very unique to other gods out there, little g gods. So that's another basic tenet. And then you try to test him in different cultures, different places of the States or different places overseas, and you try to figure out more of his attributes, more of this truth, more of what love is. And you start figuring out some commonalities. And if you don't do this in your life, then you're missing out on a lot of the story. So what would I tell you? Maybe you all have atheist friends or people in your life saying that they're committed to this lack of belief. And maybe they're asking you for evidence. It's like, oh, the onus of proof is on you. Well, the current modern-day society and every single story that's ever been told is based off of this book. Maybe the burden of proof is on you. There are scientific fields based off of the premise that God exists and that nature has order. The man himself, Charles Darwin, y'all hear of this guy before? Origins of the Species guy? He had an autobiography that his son didn't want to write on his behalf. So Charles Darwin did most of it. Page 93 of his autobiography, Charles Darwin says himself, after all my observations in the natural world, you could count me a theist. There's no other explanation for the organization of everything I experience. There's no other explanation for everything coming together and working harmoniously. Charles Darwin himself counted himself as a theist, one who believes in God and lives his life as such. And so maybe if your atheist friend tries to ask you to prove God's existence, because the burden of proof is on you, I think it's quite the reverse. Ask them to prove their lack of belief and how inconsistent it is with their actions. See, I challenge every atheist there is to act consistently as if God does not exist. They're not willing to do this. You go through apologetics and proof texts, you go through books like More Than a Carpenter, you go through Case for Christ, you go through Mere Christianity, you go through all these books. Yes, they are useful. Websites like apologeticspress.org, very useful. But for me, my logical, reasoning mind, What stood out to me? Seeing Christians, hearing their stories. If you're a Christian and you don't know how to tell your story and not inviting people around your table, then you're missing something very important. Bible class this morning, we talked about Acts chapter 16. I think it was 17, actually, where it talks about all of Paul's travels, whether it was with Timothy or Lydia or whoever else. And yes, he went to synagogues, but also the story that he told was a story from Scripture. He didn't over-exaggerate anything. He was a very educated man. He was a very well-traveled man. The story he told was from Scripture. He spoke from the Scriptures. And yes, there were Jewish converts, but a lot of them were Greeks. We think in order to entice people who don't believe in God, we need to go outside of the Bible. That's not what Paul did, and he had a lot of success. Did he lure people in with icebreakers? Like, hey, I saw that statue over there, let's talk about it. Yes. But a lot of his reasoning was speaking from this and telling these stories. I've seen people use Pixar movies as evangelism tools, but eventually they get to the story of Christ. If you have an atheistic friend who said, well, I don't know about this. I'd be a Christian if it weren't for this. Well, I wish I had as much faith as them. It's just too hard to conceive. People say, well, I believe in the Big Bang. Well, I'm pretty sure when God spoke everything into existence, it was a pretty loud noise. So maybe that was the Big Bang that you heard about. When light first started to exist, it was traveling at really high speed. Probably made some noise. Let's try not to overcomplicate things. I think that's one of the biggest things that we tend to do as ministers. We try to make all these outlines and all these lessons, and I've been up here and I tried to link philosophy and science and theology all in one lesson. Talking about forms and Wolff's Law and these scriptures. All in one lesson. I got up here and talked about psychology with archetypes. I don't think I do anything better than if somebody just got up here and read the Sermon on the Mount for 5 minutes. Young people, older people too. If that's all you do, if you get a Sunday night and you just come up here, open up Matthew chapter 5, and start with the Sermon on the Mount, it was convicting for a lot of people at the time. If that's all you do, you'll have my attention. I don't have notes up here. I don't have an outline. Usually I do. My first sermon, going back to the first story, I was in college and I wanted to contribute to the church. I accepted this responsibility of Christ, and Christ spoke at synagogue, right? So that's what I ought to do. I ought to learn how to be a teacher. Paul says to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, commit these things that I've taught you so that you can teach other people, so that those other people can teach other people. This chain of teaching. Well, so I have to learn how to be a teacher. I need to learn how to communicate. So my first sermon, I wrote it out. I wrote out every single word. I added pauses. I had highlight. In my notebook, it was 8 pages, front and back. When I typed it out, it was 4 pages. You know what I got behind the podium with? The 8 pages. I thought it looked better. It's still the same message. It's so monotone. I got the CD afterwards. It was so monotone. That's not a way to tell a story. Tell it from the heart. Is there anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. I still have the CD. If you want to listen to it, too bad. You're not going to get it. You don't need to have something prepared to go to God in prayer. When you want to talk to your loved ones around a dinner table, you don't need a script. When you want to talk about Christ, though, sometimes we feel like we need to have it all figured out. We need to figure out all the answers, all the potential questions. I did that with my dad. My dad's still an atheist. Maybe I didn't speak from the heart well enough. Maybe I wasn't as patient. Don't think you need all the answers. You're a human being. Chances are the person you're talking to is another human being. If you're talking to a wall, well, there's a lot of other things to address there. If you're talking to another human being, talk to them about your human being experience, who God is for you. For a while, the concept of God the Father didn't really make much sense to me because my relationship with my dad was very skewed. I liked the Jesus part. A friend. I was a good friend, right? I had good friends to me. So I loved learning about Jesus. Concept of the Holy Spirit? Meh. I didn't know anything about him. And then as a dad, well, I better start reading up on what God was as a father so I don't mess this up. As a teacher, well, I better start reading up on the Holy Spirit to know what that's like. To be a husband, well, I better start reading up on the relationship between Christ and the church. Here's some good places to start. But learn how to tell your story. A lot of people, they give testimonies or they tell their stories and the focus is all about them. They want the attention. They want the glory. They come up short as for what the purpose is of telling your story. The purpose of telling your story, again, to go back to the monomyth, is to tell the story about this. To tell the story about these words. It's like, okay, you don't know who Ezekiel is. You don't know how he intertwines with the story. You don't know who Esther is. You don't know how she intertwines with the story. Do you know how your story intertwines with the story? This big story. And how you could give God the glory for where you came from, who you are now, and where you're going. Can you do that? Chances are you know enough to talk to your friends, even the atheists. Sometimes your job is to be the bridge. That's what Kaylee was to me, and I still like her. Sometimes your job is the bridge. Sometimes, if you know different things, sometimes little icebreakers. Hey, let's talk about why on the 8th day maybe God told his people to be circumcised. Maybe vitamin K levels in a newborn baby are at their highest they will ever be in human life on the 8 days after they're born. So maybe it's a good day to perform surgery if you don't have anesthesia. 8th day, they're circumcised. Does God go into all that detail? No. Does he need to? No. It's a good icebreaker, though. But then you get back to the story. You don't need to overcomplicate it. Just live your life as Christ. One of those things, living our life like Christ, have an affection for the church. Love the church. As Christ's bride. Like I told the kids on Wednesday in Bible class, we had a question and answer session. I said, if you don't like my wife, you don't like me. If you don't like me, you don't like my wife. We're that unified. Well, if you don't like the church, then you don't like Christ. If you don't like Christ, then you don't like the church. So if you claim to like Christ, if you claim to love him, you ought to love the church. Learn how we communicate different kinds of love. It's okay to learn 5 love languages by Gary Chapman. It's okay to know that. Because people communicate different ways in love. Well, all those ways are in this book. Physical touch? Well, people talk all the time about feeling the hand of God. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Words of affirmation, how many times is there edification and encouraging words in here? Sing to one another, encourage one another, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Quality time, well, I think this is good quality time. I think fellowship hall time that we have is good quality time. Golden Agers banquet, that's really good quality time. What else? Gifts. That's the lowest for me, if you're keeping track. I'll still receive gifts, but rather quality time. Gift giving, the gift of salvation, that's a gift. What's the last one? Acts of service. Well, there's a lot of foot washing that goes on in that book. Within the church, there are different ways to show love. But if you love Christ, you ought to love the church. If you don't love the church, well, no better time to start than now. One way that we show love for each other is sharing our burdens. We share our encouragements when good things happen. We also share our burdens. One of those, we're about to do it, if you could tell. We've developed a tradition, and there are good traditions. We developed a tradition of standing and singing at the end of a lesson to show love and encouragement for people to walk down here and ask for prayers. At least one person or 3 people stand up here. That's a sign of good faith, of love, of welcoming. So if there are any areas that you need prayers, obviously you could go to each other, sit around a table with each other, share stories. That's a good place to do it. But another good place is to come while we stand and sing.